from saving sight to losing vision. Bashar al-Assad went from being an eye doctor to one of the most brutal dictators of our time. How did a man trained to heal end up destroying a nation? And how did his reign finally crumble in 2024? For decades, Syria was shaped by the iron will of the Assad family. Hafez al-Assad built a fortress of fear, and his son Bashar inherited that legacy. But promises of change turned into devastation and civil war. How did a regime that once seemed unshakable finally collapse? Let's uncover the rise and fall of the Assad dynasty. To understand Bashar al-Assad's regime, we have to go back to his father, Hafez al-Assad, the man who built modern Syria as we know it. Born in 1930 in the poor Alawite village of Kardaha, Hafez rose from humble beginnings to become Syria's absolute ruler. His Alawite background, a Shiite sect that made up only a small part of Syria's population, deeply influenced his leadership style. Hafez started his career as an Air Force pilot, but he had bigger ambitions. He joined the Ba'ath Party, a movement focused on Arab nationalism and socialism. In 1963, he played a role in a coup that brought the Ba'ath Party to power, turning Syria into a one-party state where the military was everything. But Hafez wanted more. In 1970, after internal power struggles, he led a corrective revolution, a bloodless coup that made him president. He held on to that power for the next 30 years. Once in power, Hafez controlled everything. He put family members and fellow Alawites in key positions and built a network of secret services to crush any opposition. Syria became a police state where speaking out against the regime was dangerous. But Hafez wasn't just about internal control. He was a master of geopolitics. During the Lebanese Civil War and the fight over the Golan Heights with Israel, he turned Syria into a key player in the Middle East. His alliance with the Soviet Union made sure Syria stayed heavily armed and strategically important. This foundation of fear, control, and strategic alliances set the stage for his son Bashar. But while Hafez ruled with an iron grip, Bashar's path would be far more complicated. When Hafez died in 2000, his son Bashar, just 34 years old, was next in line. But Bashar's rise wasn't planned. The real heir was his older brother, Basil, who had been groomed for leadership. Charismatic and prepared, Basil's sudden death in a car crash in 1994 changed everything. At the time, Bashar was working as an eye doctor in London. Politics wasn't his world. But after Basil's death, he returned to Syria and began a crash course in power, guided by his father and his father's trusted circle. His military rank shot up, and he was given important roles in the regime. Still, Bashar was seen as an odd choice. Inexperienced, soft-spoken, and more intellectual than his father or brother. After Hafez's death, the regime moved fast to keep power in the family. The constitution required a president to be at least 40 years old, so they changed it within hours to make Bashar eligible. On July 10, 2000, he was confirmed as president with 97% of the vote. But let's be real, there was no real opposition. At first, Syrians hoped Bashar would be different. He was young, educated, and modern. People thought he'd bring reforms and openness. But the regime he inherited was deeply rooted in autocracy. Bashar surrounded himself with family, his father's old allies, and loyal military leaders. Any hope of change disappeared quickly. Bashar was trapped in the same system his father created. Instead of modernizing, his presidency focused on keeping that system alive. The weight of his father's legacy would soon prove to be more than he could handle. In 2011, the Arab world erupted in protests against corruption, authoritarian rule, and economic inequality. Known as the Arab Spring, this movement spread to Syria, where decades of frustration boiled over. What began as peaceful demonstrations turned into a brutal civil war, fueled by Bashar al-Assad's violent response. Syria's problems ran deep. Corruption, unemployment, and inequality had plagued the country for years. Bashar's promised reforms never happened, and his economic policies only benefited the elite. A severe drought in the 2000s forced millions of farmers into cities, worsening the crisis. The breaking point came in March 2011, in the southern city of Dara. When teenage boys were arrested and tortured for spraying anti-government graffiti, the public erupted. Protests for justice quickly grew into demands for freedom and democracy. The regime's response? Violence. Security forces opened fire on demonstrators, igniting a nationwide uprising. As the regime's violence increased, peaceful protests turned into an armed rebellion. Opposition groups like the Free Syrian Army, or FSA, took up arms. In response, Assad's forces escalated the violence, launching airstrikes and shelling cities. Instead of offering reforms, Assad chose brutal repression. His brother, Maher al-Assad, led elite forces against rebels. The regime even used chemical weapons, like sarin and chlorine gas, causing global outrage. The 2013 gas attack on Ghouta shocked the world and was condemned as a war crime. The violence drew international attention. The UN tried to mediate, but global powers took sides. The United States and Europe supported moderate rebels, while Russia and Iran backed Assad. Syria became a proxy war, with devastating consequences for its people. The Arab Spring's hope for change turned into a nightmare for Syria. The civil war destroyed millions of lives, destabilized the region, and drew the world into the conflict. The Syrian civil war, which erupted in 2011, turned the country into a nightmare zone of death, displacement, and despair. What started as peaceful protests spiraled into a conflict that set Syria back by decades, leaving destruction in its wake. Over 500,000 people lost their lives in this war, and most of them weren't soldiers. They were ordinary people, men, women, and children killed by bombings, shellings, starvation, and chemical weapons. Cities like Aleppo, Homs, Raqqa, and Douma were almost entirely destroyed. The ancient city of Aleppo and the Roman ruins of Palmyra, once symbols of history and culture, were reduced to rubble. Airstrikes, often carried out by the regime and their Russian allies, hit places where people should have been safe: hospitals, schools, and markets. Imagine having to leave your home forever. That's what happened to more than 13 million Syrians. By 2024, 6.8 million had fled to countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and parts of Europe. Another 6.2 million were trapped inside Syria, forced to live in dangerous, overcrowded conditions. This wave of refugees put a huge strain on neighboring countries. In Lebanon, Syrian refugees made up nearly a quarter of the population, causing economic tension and social challenges. In Europe, the influx of refugees sparked political debates and growing resentment. The war didn't just kill people with bombs, it starved them. Siege tactics, where aid was blocked from reaching towns, caused famine in places like eastern Ghouta. Hospitals were bombed into oblivion, leaving millions without medical care. Over 80% of Syrians relied on humanitarian aid just to survive. Basic diseases like cholera and polio made a comeback because there wasn't enough clean water or vaccines. In a conflict filled with atrocities, the Assad regime stood out for its brutality. Prisons like Saidnaya became death chambers, where torture and executions were the norm. The regime didn't hesitate to use chemical weapons, like the horrifying sarin gas attack on Ghouta in 2013, or the chlorine attack on Khan Sheikhoun in 2017. Thousands of civilians, including children, died agonizing deaths. And it wasn't just the regime. Extremist groups like ISIS added to the horror with their own brutal tactics. Slavery, public executions, and child soldier recruitment. The whole country became a theater of cruelty. Syria's children bore the brunt of the war. Over 2 million kids dropped out of school. Many grew up in refugee camps with no education, no safety, and no hope. Some were forced to fight as child soldiers, their childhoods stolen forever. The Syrian civil war didn't stay contained within its borders. It quickly spiraled into a global proxy war, with major international powers getting involved for their own reasons. Geopolitical interests, strategic ambitions, and ideological divides turned Syria into a battleground for global influence. Russia played a huge role in keeping the Assad regime alive. Syria had been a key ally for Russia since the Cold War. The naval base in Tartus, Russia's only Mediterranean port, was too valuable to lose. When Assad's regime was on the brink of collapse in 2015, Russia stepped in with a military campaign. Russian airstrikes helped Assad reclaim critical cities like Aleppo and Homs, securing Russia's foothold in the Middle East. Iran saw the Assad regime as essential to maintaining its influence. The Shiite axis linking Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah in Lebanon was vital to Iran's regional goals. Thousands of Iranian fighters and Hezbollah militants supported Assad on the battlefield, ensuring he stayed in power and keeping Sunni rivals like Saudi Arabia and Turkey in check. The United States and Europe initially backed moderate rebel groups, hoping for a transition away from Assad. But when ISIS emerged, priorities changed. From 2014, the United States focused on defeating ISIS, working with the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. This angered Turkey, which viewed the SDF as linked to the Kurdish PKK, a group Turkey considers a terrorist organization. Turkey had conflicting goals. It wanted Assad gone and supported Sunni rebel groups, but Turkey also feared Kurdish autonomy on its border. To stop this, Turkey launched military operations against Kurdish forces in northern Syria, creating tensions with the United States and further complicating the war. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other Gulf nations saw the war as a way to weaken Iran. They funded and armed Sunni rebel groups, turning the conflict into a sectarian struggle between Sunni and Shiite forces. The chaos allowed extremist groups like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra to seize territory. In 2014, ISIS declared a caliphate, drawing international forces into Syria. Fighting these groups gave foreign powers an excuse to intervene, making the war even more chaotic. The United Nations tried to negotiate peace through conferences in Geneva and Astana, but distrust between factions and their backers made progress impossible. Russia and China used their UN Security Council veto power to block sanctions and military action against Assad. After years of relentless civil war, economic collapse, and international pressure, Bashar al-Assad's regime finally fell in December 2024. His downfall was the result of widespread protests, military defeats, and the crumbling support of Syria's elite. Forced to flee to Russia, his exit marked the end of a brutal era and left Syria in a state of uncertainty. By 2020, Syria's crisis had deepened. The economy was in ruins, crushed by the war and international sanctions. The Syrian pound lost over 90% of its value. Everyday essentials like food and fuel became unaffordable. Famine and unemployment soared. The elite continued to profit from corruption and black market deals, while the general population suffered. Even pro-regime communities grew resentful. By 2022, cities like Daraa, Suwaida, and even parts of Damascus saw renewed protests. Syrians demanded reform and an end to oppression. Security forces struggled to contain the growing unrest. On the battlefield, things fell apart. Rebel forces in northern Syria launched new offensives, capturing key cities like Aleppo and Idlib. Assad's foreign allies, Iran and Russia, were distracted by their own crises and reduced support. By late 2024, Assad's regime was crumbling. Damascus was surrounded by rebel groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, and the Syrian National Army, or SNA. The Syrian army's loyalty fractured. Soldiers deserted or refused to fight. In a desperate move, Assad begged Russia for direct military intervention. But Russia, wary of deeper involvement, refused. On December 15, 2024, as rebels closed in on Damascus, Assad realized the fight was lost. In the early hours of December 16, 2024, Russia organized a secret escape for Assad, his wife Asma, their children, and a handful of close allies. A Russian military plane flew them out of Damascus to an undisclosed location in Russia. The operation was shrouded in secrecy to avoid rebel attacks. Russia, heavily invested in Assad's regime, offered him asylum to protect their interests. In return, Assad was expected to use his wealth and influence to support Russian ambitions in the Middle East. Assad's new life in Russia was luxurious but hollow. He and his family settled in a lavish villa near Moscow, guarded by Russian security. The villa had every comfort: a private gym, swimming pool, and sprawling gardens. But it was a far cry from the absolute power he once wielded. The international community condemned Russia's decision to shelter Assad. Human rights organizations called for his arrest and trial for war crimes. But Russia refused to extradite him, shielding Assad from justice while Syrians continued to suffer. Assad's flight had major consequences for Syria and the Middle East. With Assad gone, a vacuum opened. Rebels, Kurdish militias, and jihadist groups scrambled for control, creating more chaos. Iran lost a key ally, weakening its grip on the region. Russia kept its military bases but saw its influence in Syria slip away. Syria now faced several possibilities: a federal state with regional autonomy, a transitional government under UN supervision, or a long period of fragmentation and instability. The rise and fall of the Assad dynasty is a story of power, brutality, and missed opportunities. What began with Hafez al-Assad's iron-fisted rule ended with Bashar al-Assad's collapse into exile. Decades of corruption, repression, and war shattered Syria, leaving behind a humanitarian crisis and a nation struggling to rebuild from the ruins. The end of the Assad era opened a new chapter of uncertainty, but it also signaled the end of a regime that had held Syria in a grip of fear for far too long. For more stories that uncover the hidden truths of our world, subscribe to WanderWatch.